niche and get ahead in the competition with that. Because this is going to lead to a lot of orders for power generation equipment, synchrophasers, and so on and so forth. They're trying to take it.
Yeah, the second part of that is, will there be collaboration so that there is a standard internationally worldwide, or is this something where each country is going to go off and implement their own type of infrastructure?
Well, I hope there is coordination. This is a very, very complex problem technologically, and I think in the long run it benefits everybody. But again, this is a competitive world. So it's again, the market forces are going to play against the need for cooperation. So I don't think anybody can predict that ahead of time. Whether it will be a single standard or multiple standard, whether there will be European Union standard and a separate US standard. This has happened in the past. So there's no reason why it cannot happen again, but I certainly hope it does not happen.
I think that's an excellent question. I can answer a little bit relative to the work I'm doing with the IEEE and also some of the work that the DOE and the FERC are asking for, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And because the industry of smart grid is really in its infancy, there is a push to keep the standards open, to actually allow this to facilitate development. A lot of the worldwide vehicle manufacturers are also very interested in that. And as Sanjay said, there are some differences in the European Union and in China. Some of the work that the IEEE is trying to do, because it is global in nature, is to bring these different standards together so that we can map it out and actually help those that are developing products or services to have the greatest degree of market spread.
When you talk about whether things are going to look the same, well, the issues are the issues, I think. And so whether there's going to be consistency is a question that's difficult to ask unless you say in what. So is there going to be consistency in the hardware? Maybe. In the standards? Maybe. But over top, there's going to be overlays. So for example, the EU has very strong data protection rules. If they're going to allow commodification of consumer information, even anonymous, there would need to be changes. That's something that could be done here. It might be written on top of the open standard. So you sort of almost need to think in layers. And even when you think network layers of hardware and protocols and data links, and then on top the applications that run, use almost a side layer of the actual grid itself and how that interacts with these conceptions. And regulation sits there, market sits there, consumers sit there, and then surrounding the whole thing is uncertainty.
Sure, go ahead.
I guess speaking of the overlays, talking about the overlays of technologies and the privacy, et cetera, my very basic understanding of the grid currently is that it's more of a kind of a 19th century infrastructure when people weren't really thinking about smart grids. Are we talking about a smart grid, or to what extent are we talking about overlays of new technology on top of existing infrastructure? And to what extent does the current physical plant just have to be replaced to make a real smart grid?
So maybe I'll take it from the view of a utility. You're absolutely correct when you say, when was the grid actually first established, designed? If you go back 100 years ago, we look at three very important individuals, one being Nikola Tesla, second one being George Westinghouse, and not that far back, and the third one, of course, being Edison. And it was Tesla's, design to actually foster the long-distance transmission of electricity via alternating current. And at the current standard at that time was to really look at small, regional, direct current applications. And so what you ended up having is small, local utilities designing systems in a centralized, top-down, vertically integrated fashion for the needs of their particular territory. And over time, these territories then were protected by local public service commissions, public utility commissions, under a franchise territory that obligated that company to serve all the customers in that territory in a non-discriminatory fashion. And so what happened is, if you looked at the map of the US, you would see many times utilities having distribution voltages that are not necessarily the same. You may have 13.2, 13.8, some of them are delta systems, some of them are Y systems. And the question always is, well, why are these differences existing? And sometimes you really have to go back and see whether that particular utility was designing for heavy industrial loads, or were they designing for mostly residential and small commercial or agricultural loads? So now you fast forward 100 years, and what's different? What's different is a lot of the territories now have grown economically. The loads have changed from mechanical to electromechanical to all electronics, totally different waveforms, totally different expectations about what reliability is all about. 50 years ago, 100 years ago, if you had a momentary outage and you were a job shop operation, you probably could withstand that interruption. Fast forward it today, imagine that you are a payment processing center that runs 24/7, 365. Where is your opportunity to take that plant, that particular building down for maintenance, much less to try to accept, you know, one or two second interruption in electricity. So that takes us to today. We're talking about the system being built on a platform. So all of your internet, all of the telecommunications, all of the computer technology, you could say, were layered on top of that. Totally different expectations in terms of what's acceptable for operations. Now when you fast forward it and you say, we've got an infrastructure that in some parts of the country, especially Western New York, you know, really grew up under the Tesla days. How do we actually upgrade that infrastructure? It's probably not reasonable to assume we're going to pull it all out and put in new technology. You're looking at trying to advance it in a way that makes economic sense and certainly doesn't provide any rate shock for the consumers. I hope that helps.
And and that's actually happening today. Sanjay talked about demand response. He talked about wind. Those are issues that we're dealing with today. In the control centers, we're trying to upgrade our tools to be able to forecast what's going to happen to the wind. We're changing the way they do operations out there to be able to keep an eye on that and predict it as it grows and becomes a bigger piece of the equation. The processes, procedures, and the tools that they need to manage that, continue to evolve. Demand response is another aspect of that. When you talk about wind, it's not just what we've also found. You learn from experience, right? It's not just the day where there's no breeze that's a problem. What you find out also is when there's great wind gusts, all of a sudden you have a tremendous amount of wind generation that suddenly cuts out because these generators have to shut off to protect themselves from damage, and so you have to be able to be prepared for that kind of thing too. So this aspect of kind of incremental advancement is important, and it's an important way of kind of figuring out the real world problems and adjusting and adapting.
Ron? Go ahead. How much is this going to cost me? Because I assume the individual ratepayer is going to pay for it, and what benefits am I going to get?
Well, as far as pricing goes, I'll give it to the utility here.
Thanks, Sanjay. I thought we were sharing here. It's a great question. I think one of our recent rate cases, we were projecting somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 cents a month for a residential customer. Now, I have to caution you with any type of estimate, it's always based on certain conditions, certain assumptions. The real answer, I think the more appropriate answer is it's going to depend. And the depend is based on what the ratepayers in that community really want to see for the future. And I mean that very sincerely, because what we're trying to do as a utility is to actually reach out to the consumers and say, we think that the future may look like this. And we think in order to actually drive to that, sorry for the pun, but actually move in that direction, we're going to need to make these types of investments, which will provide services like the ability to actually look at your building envelope in your home, look at that load curve, and determine what it is that's driving the largest consumption for your home during that month. And then to maybe set a predetermined budget for yourself, and then to allow the system to actually prompt you when you're getting close to that budget, and then you're in control and you decide whether you want to actually maintain the budget that you set or whether you want to override it. Other concepts that are being talked about is the ability to allow some of the appliances in your home to have a smart chip that would wirelessly communicate to your meter and to your smart app so that you could determine when the best time of the day was to run that appliance. There have been 2 scientists that have articles posted on the web right now that have taken this technology, actually applied it to their smart app on their smartphone, and been able to access their energy profile while they were at a conference remote from their home. 2 examples. The first scientist did it on Friday night about 2 a.m. to see what was going on in his house, and he saw this incredible peak about midnight, and it was about midnight that he actually called home, and he was curious because he knew he only had teenagers at home, and certainly, you know, that would have been past their bedtime, and to his surprise he found that there was a party going on. So, and the second scientist decided, boy, that's an intriguing experiment, let me try the same thing in my home, put in the same type of smart meter, the same type of smart app, and what he was curious about was what was really happening in his home while he was at work, he and his wife. And so he looked at his energy usage over a week's period, and he saw this enormous peak around noon, 12 o'clock. And he thought, well, everybody's at work and the kids are in school, so what's possibly the problem? So he didn't live that far from his office. He drove home, parked his car in an area, do you know the story? Yes. Parked his car
I can imagine the story.
in an area where no one could see him, but he could see who was coming and going in his house. About 12 o'clock that day, he happened to see his teenage son walking into his home, and so he got out of his car and proceeded to walk in after his son. My only comment is I wouldn't want to be that son, you know, I'd have a minor heart attack at that time. But in terms of sincerely answering the question, what can it do for you? I think we're on the verge of actually exploring that. In my view, my personal view, I think smart grid is going to become an enabler, just like the smart applications were for the cell phones. And I'll use that example that now you have a cell phone that, you know, probably lowest on your priority list, it actually allows you to take and receive calls, but you're able to do other things on it. So I think the real answer to you is kind of stay tuned.
Sorry, go ahead, Tom.
I think you not only need to look at it in the short run, but I think the long run, what it does to the consumer is bring a lot of energy security. I think that's the real premise for smart grid. Bring a lot of alternate energy sources, you're not completely dependent on fossil fuels. I think so in the very long-term perspective. So it's to the benefit of all the consumers that we reduce the dependence on fossil fuels, and that's what the smart grid will enable. In addition to the demand response, where you can lower your electricity usage or the prices by using it in off-peak hours. So that's there. I mean, I think overall for most people who are conscious, they'll be able to reduce their electricity cost because they wouldn't use peak electricity. But I think the real benefits come in the long run when you're actually reducing the national dependence on fossil fuels and adding more energy stability. I think that's how we need to look at this.
I think I completely agree with that. That's the main impetus for this, is to deal with the capacity load of the system and with needs for generation outside of the traditional ones and lowering overall usage. It's going to be sold to you in the way that various healthcare reforms have been. Why is healthcare so expensive? Because we don't actually see how much healthcare costs. Make the consumer see it, they'll shop around, they'll change their behavior, and they'll do what a market should do. What are we doing now? We're approximating that through regulation. We're having rate proceedings, rate hearings, about how much can be charged. Who decides? The government. Which is better? In terms of actually being able to manipulate market costs, I don't have a lot of confidence that this is going to end up with consumers with lower bills, which honestly is what consumers are worried about. I think the bills are going to stay up. I think the price that's paid is up. We may have to use less. That means you're paying more. But in terms of these other concerns, there's sort of this shadow on top of them of, oh, you'll be able to control. In some of the experiments that have done, consumers are actually paying more when they move to this system. In the Northwest, there have been a couple where consumers are paying at least even or more than they used to pay on a per monthly basis. And they're trying to control. You read the article, one guy's like, we only do laundry after 11 at night, and we're paying more. That's sort of the direction that I see it going. Is there an avoidance for that? I don't know, unless we can get quantum delivery of electricity without wires, I think we're stuck.